that it's from that Babylonian Empire that the Antichrist comes, and we know that from the study of the book of Revelation that the Antichrist utilizes the world of policy or politics as well as the role of financing to captivate the people. And we know that this is something much more than just some religious organization like the Catholics, the Muslims, the Jehovah's Witnesses, or any other group people want to put the label on that is Babylon. Another thing that Babylon isn't America. A lot of people like to preach Babylon is the U.S., but Babylon is not the U.S. And again, the U.S., as prosperous, as wealthy as we are, as much money as we literally provide to other countries, and as much trade as much trade as we literally dole out at our largesse, our government's largesse, to other countries, the things that we enter into negotiation and trade with, the fact that they have much human resource. I think in lieu of even September 11th, we've been told that it's because of this that, they took 2 airplanes and blew up the World Trade Center, and yet there's nothing further from the truth. These are negotiated aspects of business. You can't get mad because you determine you're going to sell us cotton cheap. These are negotiated. If they're going to be mad, they should be mad at the people who negotiated these deals and not mad at us. The bottom line is we have things they don't, and they think it's our fault. Yet if the U.S. was to disappear, you're going to have a lot of segments of the world celebrating. And yet, believe me, I'll tell you, England's going to pick up the slack real quick. So even if America sunk, as tragic as that would be on the world market, not every sailor's going to cry. So we're talking about something much greater, something much bigger than even the U.S. As we read the book of Revelation, we're not going to read it. That was our intro, all right? We're going to pick up where we left off. I gave you the sheet of paper. We stopped. I thought maybe we should continue in Rule by Secrecy, Jim Marrs. You'll probably, again, if you have opportunity to pick this book up, I think it's only $11. It's for a paperback copy. We were talking about Rockefeller being probably one of the most famous millionaires of our particular generation. As a kid, anytime you try to play big spender, everybody would say something like, "Oh, you think you're Rockefeller?" So everybody understood and everybody knew what this was about. But we're going to go on because there's other people. Again, one of the reasons I like Rule by Secrecy is because, like a program at a ball game, you get to see the players. And he does a very good job in concisely. Now, this doesn't cover everything, but very concisely lists these individuals, who they are, what they've done, what they're known for. And in doing that, we at least get a good framework as to who these people are, what they did, what their role was in government, because for darn sure, nobody ever told us about these characters at school. We learned about how giving they were, how beneficent they were in their giving, and Rockefeller donating his land for the UN and things of this sort. And everybody thinks, oh, what a wonderful guy. This guy was a vice president. They tell us all these things, but they never tell us about their intentions, nor do they tell us about their plan, nor do they tell us that these are the people who literally are in that top percentile of people in the world that literally run the world. So we're in page 54 in your little handout there. You got the page there. It says the Morgans. Prior to that, we read the Rockefeller portion of the story. We're talking about the Morgans. Now, what Rick is giving you is also another piece of the puzzle. You can probably read that later. We might even get to that today. But that's out of Secrets of the Federal Reserve by Eustace Mullins. And we'll be getting into that also. You'll find it very interesting, very fascinating. We're almost to the point where we're ready to pick up on that train that left on its way to take these men to Jekyll Island, where they sat with these secretive individuals setting up that which we know as the Federal Reserve. So you'll get a kick out of looking at that. But let's go ahead and start with page 54. Down at the bottom of the left hand, the Morgans. If John D. Rockefeller had an equal in the halcyon days of the robber barons, it was John Pierpont Morgan. Everybody's heard of J.P. Morgan. If you haven't heard of J.P. Morgan, Morgan Stanley. And, they took a serious blow in the World Trade Center disaster also. John Pierpont Morgan, a man even more demonstrably connected with an Anglophile network. And that's a pretty fancy word. Anglophile literally means that they are English. The Morgan banking empire continues to hold sway of both businesses and political decisions being made today. Now, how many of you know that? Morgan banking empire continues to hold and sway over. Now, anybody been listening to the Enron news? Everybody's trying to figure out what happened to Enron. Everybody knows what happened to Enron. Somebody took the money and ran. There's nothing else to figure out. But while they're looking at this Enron stuff, they're trying to figure out where it all came from. But you got companies like Enron, Arthur Andersen, these huge companies doling out money to politicians. And they're finding out that several of these politicians are literally what I refer to, the word I'd rather use is sponsored. Because they're pointing fingers at congressmen saying, well, you took Enron money. Yeah, but I took Citicorp money. Well, I took Morgan money. Every one of these guys is backed and supported by one of these bank groups. Now, isn't that a shock and surprise? Anyway, the Morgan banking empire, and you'll hear this on the news as this Enron story continues to unfold before you, because what happened with Enron was immediately the Democratic Party tried to lay that on the Republicans because the Republicans are in power with the presidency. So they said, hey, look, they gave the Bush administration all this money, only to find out as they stuck their noses in deeper that there's a lot of Democrats that had Enron money in their back pocket, as well as the Clinton administration. So everybody is taking their money. So I can start to see where the book of Revelation tells you something, and that's that great whore sleeps with everybody. You're not exclusive. All right? It's like Marilyn Monroe. All right? Robert Kennedy wasn't the only Kennedy doing it. All right? How'd you like to have Peter Lawford for a pimp? Some of you don't remember these guys. The Morgan banking empire continues to hold sway over both business and political decisions being made today. And please take your pens, your markers, and all those things you got from whoever that was that donated all those. Get those markers and start marking these pages so that you have something to refer to. The Morgan banking empire continues to hold sway over both businesses and political decisions being made today, and many Morgan employees and agents can be counted among the membership of the secret societies. Morgan's mother was Juliet Pierpont Morgan, whose father, the Reverend John Pierpont, was vocally pro-British and the son of a Yale University founder. J.P. Morgan's father, Junius Spencer Morgan, was an American financier who traveled to England in the 1850s, where he was befriended by another expatriate American named George Peabody. And some of you will recognize that name. Peabody will always be one of the names mentioned when it comes to the big banking houses and financing in America, especially on the eastern seaboard. So he's connected with Peabody, a man already doing business with the British Rothschilds, and you know about the Rothschilds already. Joining with Peabody under the name Peabody Morgan and Company, Junius's wealth grew as a result of obtaining loans from the North during the American Civil War. Now, isn't that wonderful? Making the right investments during the war. His son John Pierpont Morgan was born in 1837. Junius and his son took charge of the business upon the retirement of Peabody in 1864 and promptly changed the name to Morgan and Company. The Morgans, too, became closely connected to the British Rothschilds, even staying in their home on occasion. Many authors have written that the Morgans eventually became covert agents for the Rothschilds. Morgan's activities in 1895, 1896 in selling U.S. gold bonds in Europe were based on his alliance with the House of Rothschild. Noted author Gabriel Coco. The idea that the Morgans were the American front for Britain's Baron Nathan Meyer Rothschild's interests was also advanced by Eustace Mullen, the author who in 1952 first revealed the maneuvering which resulted in the creation of a Federal Reserve System. Regarding the Rothschilds, Mullins wrote, even though they had a registered agent in the United States, it's extremely advantageous to them to have an American representative who was not known as a Rothschild agent. Mullins said, the Rothschilds preferred to operate anonymously in the United States behind the facade of J.P. Morgan and Company. So who actually pulls the strings in America? Rothschild, but with an even bigger picture. They refer to them as Anglophiles, but the English. All right, let's go on. Part of the reality of the day was that an ugly resurgence of anti-Semitism wrote George Wheeler, author of Pierpont Morgan and Friends, Anatomy of a Myth. Someone was needed as a cover. Who better than J.P. Morgan, a solid Protestant, exemplar of capitalism, able to trace his family back to pre-revolutionary times. The possibilities are obvious that a major portion of the wealth and power of the Morgan firm was and always had been merely the wealth and power of the Rothschilds, who raised it up from the beginning and sustained it through its entire existence, agreed author Giffen. So Morgan money comes from where? Rothschilds. Although J.P. Morgan was born in America and educated in Boston in 1856, he traveled to Germany, where he studied at the University of Göttingen, founded by England's George II in 1737, who was then serving as Elector of Hanover. Notorious for its expulsion of dissident professors called the Göttingen Seven, which included the brothers Grimm. Everybody knows about Grimm's fairy tales, right? And other adherents of George Hegel, including Karl Marx. The university continued to be a hotbed of anti-establishment and secret society activity. This is a wonderful place to send your kid to school. Returning to the United States, Morgan joined the New York banking firm of Duncan Sherman and Company, the American representative of their London company. Thereafter, Morgan appears to have served as a Rothschild financial agent and went to great lengths to appear totally American, Griffin wrote. The outbreak of the American Civil War, young Morgan demonstrated that legalities and honesty play little part in his business practices. May 1861, 24-year-old Morgan offered to sell 5,000 military rifles to the commander of the Federal Army stationed at St. Louis for $22 apiece. The commander, desperate for rifles, agreed, but when the rifles arrived, he refused payment, claiming the weapons were obsolete and defective. Morgan sued the Army and won a court judgment ordering that he be paid the $109,912. Congressional Investigating Committee in 1862 concluded that Morgan had defrauded the government. The committee found that the rifles, considered thoroughly unserviceable, obsolete, and dangerous, had been bought for $3.50 each from a New York arsenal by Simon Stevens, who was employed by Morgan. Isn't that something? You buy $3.50 rifles and you sell them for $22 to the government, and then you sue them. When the St. Louis commander agreed to buy the weapons unseen, Morgan used the agreement as collateral to borrow money for the weapons. So the U.S. Army had bought its own defective rifles from Morgan. Can you imagine? U.S. government's getting rid of rifles. He buys them, sells them back to them, sues them, and wins. U.S. Army had bought its own defective rifles from Morgan, who at no financial risk to himself realized about 500% profit on each gun. 1871, he became partner in one of his father's firms, Drexel, Morgan and Company. And anybody who knows anything about the financial world, Drexel, Morgan's still around. Drexel, Morgan and Company, which later simply became J.P. Morgan and Company, this firm soon became the predominant source of U.S. government financing. And again, there you've got that aspect or that angle from these financiers. It's not enough to lend just normal people money. You got to lend it to the government. What do you get from the government? Get greater returns. Because of his links with Peabody firm, Morgan had intimate and highly useful connections with the London financial world. During the 1870s, he was thereby able to provide the rapidly growing industrial corporations of the U.S. with much needed capital from British bankers, noted the New Encyclopedia Britannica. Next to the European Rothschild family, the Morgan Company became one of the most powerful banking houses in the world. But that was enough for J.P. Morgan, who inherited the family interest in 1890 following his father's death in a carriage accident on the French Riviera. 5 years earlier, he began the organization of America's largest railroads, and by 1902, he was the world's most powerful railroad magnate, controlling about 5,000 miles of track. Morgan even helped bail out the U.S. government following a bank panic in 1893, forming a syndicate. Morgan propped up the government's depleted reserves with $62 million in Rothschild gold, and that's something. In the 1890s, he oversaw a merger of the Edison General Electric and the Thomson Houston Electric Company to form General Electric, which quickly dominated the electrical equipment manufacturing. Next, Morgan merged several steel firms to form United States Steel Corporation. In 1902, he created the International Harvester Company out of several competing agricultural equipment manufacturers. This diversified Morgan empire has never been equaled and continues to dominate the American financial industry to this day. Through a system of interlocking memberships on the boards of companies he had reorganized or influenced, Morgan and his banking house achieved top-heavy concentration of control over some of the nation's leading corporations and financial institutions, explained the New Encyclopedia Britannica. The empire extended to include tax-exempt foundations, trusts, pension funds, and even government positions. Such manipulation can explain how control of the commercial and economic life of the United States was achieved and maintained for those with the knowledge, willpower, and wealth. Although J.P. Morgan and John D. Rockefeller competed with each other in many areas, in the end they worked together to create the national banking cartel known as the Federal Reserve System, wrote Griffin. The initial plan for the Federal Reserve System was conceived at a secret meeting in 1910 at Morgan's private resort on Jekyll Island off the coast of Georgia. Morgan connected with the Rockefellers through his investment associate, Nelson Aldrich. Remained a dominant American capitalist until his death in 1913. The same year, the Fed was created. Morgan's son, John Pierpont Jr., was known as Jack, continued to increase the family's fortune following his father's death. Groomed to take his place as the head of the Morgan Empire, the younger Morgan spent 8 years working in the firm's London office, developing close ties to Britain's elite banking circles. During World War I, Morgan organized more than 2,000 banks for the underwriting of more than $1 billion in Allied bonds. He became the only banker to purchase supplies, both military and otherwise, for the British and the French government during the war. This indicates considerable leverage and clout within those two governments, again suggesting the involvement of the Rothschilds. Now, we're done with that. We just want to basically name the players. So we already dealt with the Rothschild, the Morgans, as well as the Rothschilds, Morgans, and Rockefeller. Now grab your chapter 3, I think is what you have, right? What's your page titled? The Aldrich Plan? Let me see yours. The one that Rick passed out. Jekyll Island. All right. I think we left off here. On the night of November 22nd, 1910, a group of newspaper reporters stood disconsolately at the railroad station of Hoboken, New Jersey. They had just watched a delegation of the nation's leading financiers leave the station on a secret mission. It would be years before they discovered what that mission was, and even then they would not understand that the history of the United States underwent a drastic change after that night in Hoboken. The delegation had left in a sealed railway car with blinds drawn for an undisclosed destination. They were led by Senator Nelson Aldrich, head of the National Monetary Commission. President Theodore Roosevelt had signed into law the bill creating the National Monetary Commission in 1908 after the Panic of 1907. It resulted in a public outcry that the nation's monetary system would be stabilized. Aldrich had led the members of the commission on a 2-year tour of Europe, spending at least $300,000 of public money. He didn't even make a report on his trip, but he offered it, nor did he offer any plan for banking reform. Now, we read this already, so I'm going to leave a lot of this for you to read because we kind of left off in here, but go ahead and go to page number 4, because this is actually where we left off. Page 4, last paragraph starts out with the Jekyll Island Group. Tells you who the players were. They all get together at Jekyll Island. Paul Warburg was the one, the German, who's literally taking charge of this meeting, hammering out his knowledge of banking to form that which we call the Federal Reserve Bank. The Jekyll Island Group had remained at the club for 9 days, working furiously to complete their task. Despite the common interest of those present, the work did not proceed without friction. Senator Aldrich, always domineering person, considered himself a chosen leader of the group and could not help ordering everybody else around. Aldrich also felt somewhat out of place as the only member who was not a professional banker. Doesn't leave that to a politician, huh? He had a substantial banking interest throughout his career, but only as a person who profited from his ownership of bank stock. He knew little about the technical aspects of financial operations. His opposite number, Paul Warburg, believed in every question raised by the group demanded not merely an answer, but a lecture. He rarely lost an opportunity to give the members a long discourse designed to impress them with the extent of his knowledge of banking. This was resented by the others and often drew barbed remarks from Aldrich. The natural diplomacy of Henry P. Davidson proved to be the catalyst which kept them at their work. Warburg's thick alien accent grated on them and constantly reminded them that they had to accept the presence if a central bank plan was to be developed, which would guarantee them the future profits. Warburg made little effort to smooth over their prejudices and contested them on every possible occasion on the technical banking questions which he considered his private preserve. In all conspiracies, there must be great secrecy. The monetary reform plan prepared at Jekyll Island was to be presented to Congress as the completed work of the National Monetary Commission. So Aldrich, that was actually appointed head of the Monetary Commission, had taken this 2-year leave literally to travel Europe because they supposedly had already nailed down the banking practice. And he took his 300 grand, went out there and spent it, came back to Jekyll Island where he got together with the bankers where they were going to hammer out a plan where he was going to then take that plan, plagiarize it, present it to Congress as his plan or the results of his study of European banking. Now, doesn't that stink already? All right. The monetary reform plan prepared at Jekyll Island was to be presented to Congress as a completed work of the National Monetary Commission. It was imperative that the real authors of the bill remain hidden. Now, why would you want to hide it? You don't want the public to know who did it? So great was the popular resentment against the bankers since the panic of 1907 that no congressman would dare vote for a bill bearing the name of Wall Street or bearing a Wall Street taint, no matter who had contributed to his campaign expenses. The Jekyll Island plan was a call for a central banking plan. And in this country, there was a long tradition of struggle against inflicting a central bank on the American people. Now, first of all, in looking at the history of our country, our founding fathers, having broken away from King George, understanding that the man who runs the money runs the nation, they opposed totally the concept or idea of there being any kind of central banking, because with central banking comes oppression. They understood this. The Jekyll Island plan was a central bank plan, and this country had a long tradition of struggle against inflicting a central bank on the American people. It had begun with Thomas Jefferson's fight against Alexander Hamilton's scheme for the first Bank of the United States, backed by James Rothschild. Wouldn't you figure that? It had continued with President Andrew Jackson's successful war against Alexander Hamilton's scheme for the second Bank of the United States, in which Nicholas Biddle was the acting agent for James Rothschild of Paris. The result of that struggle was the creation of an independent sub-treasury system, which supposedly had served to keep funds of the United States out of the hands of the financiers. A study of the panics of 1873, 1893, and 1907 indicate that those panics were the result of the international bankers' operations in London. Now, if there was no control of finances in America by Englishmen, there was no manipulation in London that could have literally wreaked the havoc that it did during those times. So they already had enough influence in our country to manipulate these particular bank panics. The public was demanding in 1908 that Congress enact legislation to prevent the recurrence of an artificially induced money panic. Such monetary reform now seemed inevitable. It was the head off and control such reform that the National Monetary Commission had been set up with Nelson Aldrich at his head, since he was the majority leader of the Senate. The main problem was, as Paul Warburg informed his colleagues, was to avoid the name central bank. For that reason, he decided upon the designation of Federal Reserve System. This would deceive the people into thinking it was not a central bank. However, the Jekyll Island plan would be a central bank plan, fulfilling the main functions of a central bank. It would be owned by private individuals who would profit from ownership of shares. As a bank of issue, it would control the nation's money and credit. So, if anything, what you see here is that somebody already is plotting. Now that people understand what the Federal Reserve Bank is, that it is in fact the creation and the tool of private bankers. Now that people understand that the fact that it's called Federal Reserve means it has absolutely nothing to do with the federal government. Now that people understand this, why do we have such a problem believing that these people had established conspiracy to create this? Why not call it a bank after their name rather than calling it Federal Reserve Bank? Now I'm going to read, I don't none dare call it conspiracy, so hold your fingers in that spot. Out of the Jekyll Island meeting came the completion of the Monetary Commission report and the Aldrich Bill. Warburg had proposed the bill to be designated as the Federal Reserve System. Aldrich insisted his own name already associated the public's mind with banking reform, and that it would arouse suspicion. If a bill were introduced that did not bear his name. However, Aldrich's name attached to the bill proved to be the kiss of death. So here's that idiot Aldrich. He just can't get past the idea that he's in charge of the Monetary Commission and that the bank bill is not going to have his name. Now remember, he toured Europe, spent all the taxpayers' money, comes back without a report. They go to Jekyll Island, and he's going to take the drafts from Jekyll Island, and he's going to present it to Congress as his banking reform bill. Now, they come up with these bills, and they're hammering out the details, and now Aldrich is saying, well, since I'm the head of the Monetary Commission, it should have my name on it. Isn't that like a politician? Just a stinking limelighter. Wants his name on it. By the way, the Aldrich bill failed. However, with Aldrich's name attached to it, the bill proved to be the kiss of death, since any law bearing his name was so obviously a project of international bankers. The people weren't that stupid. When the Aldrich bill could not be pushed through Congress, a new strategy had to be devised. The Republican Party was too closely connected with Wall Street. The only hope for a central bank was to disguise it and have it put through by the Democrats. Now, the Republicans push it through, and it don't make it. So now the bankers say, we got to run it back through the Democrats. and it passes. So who's controlling both parties? See, this is why I say I think people are foolish when they start fighting even among party lines, because the same exact goal is held by both sides. That's why I've often said the only thing you're voting for is who you want to screw you, because you're going to get it. But you get to pick who gets to do it to you. All right? They both have the same agenda. They both have the exact same goal in mind. They're just going to get you there a different way. And depending on your outview in life is which party you usually affiliate with. A Democrat sees teenage pregnancy and says, we need education. So they'll throw billions of dollars at education. A Republican looks at it and says, screw them. Let them bear the stigma of single parents. Let them get jobs. Let them pay for daycare. Let them bear that negative stigma, and it'll stop. They both have the same goal, just two ideas of how to get it. But they're both going to get you to the same place. Had to be pushed through by the Democrats as a measure to strip Wall Street of its power. Now listen, the people or the public at large says, you know, if them Republicans are behind it, it's money. It's private money. We don't want them to run it through. So they defeat it. So now they run it through with the Democrats. And with the Democrats, the language changes this. We got to pass this bill to keep it out of the Republicans' hands. We're going to keep this money away from Wall Street. And what was really happening? They were giving the money to Wall Street. The opportunity to do this came with the approach of the 1912 presidential election. Republican President William Howard Taft, who had turned against the Aldrich bill, seemed a surefire bet to re-election until Taft's predecessor, fellow Republican Teddy Roosevelt, again agreed to run on the ticket of the Progressive Party. Now, we've talked about this before. William Taft, man, he was riding high. No war. He was a shoo-in to be re-elected. There was no reason for him not to be re-elected. Why would another Republican throw his hat into the ring as a progressive to split the vote so that somebody who wasn't even slated to win can win? In America's 60 Families, Ferdinand Lundberg acknowledges, as soon as Roosevelt signified he would again challenge Taft, the president's defeat was inevitable. Throughout the three-cornered fight, Taft, Roosevelt, and Wilson, Roosevelt had Morgan agents Frank Munsey and George Perkins constantly at his heels, supplying money, going over his speeches, bringing people from Wall Street to help, and in general, the entire burden of the campaign against Taft. Perkins and J.P. Morgan and Company were the substance of the Progressive Party. Everything else was the trimming. In short, most of Roosevelt's campaign fund was supplied by the two Morgan hatchet men who were seeking Taft's scalp. So you got people throwing money at you, and they're rigging the election. Now, isn't rigging the election illegal? Huh? How come these people historically can rig an election and nobody says anything? This is what I tell you. You know, they teach you history in school, but they don't teach you. How can anybody say they got an education if they didn't learn? They're too busy trying to teach our kids to save the whales and trees. Bunch of tree huggers. The Democratic candidate Woodrow Wilson was equally the property of Morgan. Isn't that something? The J.P. Morgan is financing the Progressive Party, but he's also financing Woodrow Wilson. He was equally the property of Morgan. Dr. Gabriel Kolko in the Triumph of the Conservatism reports, in the late 1907, he, Wilson, supported the Aldrich Bill on banking and was full of praise for Morgan's role in the American society. According to Lundberg, for nearly 20 years before his nomination, Woodrow Wilson had moved into the shadow of Wall Street. Woodrow Wilson and Teddy Roosevelt proceeded to whistle-stop the country, trying to outdo each other in florid and hypocritical denunciations of the Wall Street Money Trust, the same group of insiders which was financing both of their campaigns. Now, isn't that something to go on the campaign trail, slamming the money trust, and yet they finance you? Now, isn't that what's happening right now with Enron? Everybody's trying to back themselves off, talking about how they want to get those people behind it, and yet every one of them had their pocket stuffed by these folk. Huh? And then you got all those employees trying to act like, oh, poor me. Oh, I can't believe they did this to me. They're just as responsible for being greedy. I mean, nobody puts all their retirement into one basket. They did. Why? Because they got greedy. I just get tired of watching these guys cry on television. I had over $2 million in there, and now I got 700. You feel sorry for somebody who gambled with their pension? Huh? All right. Dr. Coco goes on to tell us at the beginning of 1912, banking reform seemed a dead issue. The banking reform movement had nearly isolated itself. Wilson resurrected the issue and promised the country a money system free from the domination of the international bankers of Wall Street. Now, this is what Woodrow Wilson is campaigning. Woodrow Wilson sold out our nation. Moreover, the Democratic platform expressly stated, "We're opposed to the Aldrich plan for a central bank." But the big boys knew who they had bought. Among the international financiers who contributed heavily to the Wilson campaign, in addition to those already named, were Jacob Schiff, Bernard Baruch, Henry Morgenthau, Thomas Fortune Ryan, the New York Times publisher Adolph Oakes. The insider sheepdog who controlled Wilson and guided the program through Congress was the mysterious Colonel Edward Mandell House, the British-educated son of a representative of England's financial interests in the American South. His title was honorary. House never served in the military. He was strictly behind-the-scenes wire puller, is regarded by many historians as the real president of the United States during the Wilson years. Now, Woodrow Wilson did not even have his own mind. I didn't bring it with me. It's in my car. Maybe I should have brought it, because we should all read it. Colonel House, Texan, wrote a book. It was literally a novel. It was actually called Philip Drew Administrator, about a West Point cadet who took a girl out on a date, and he got lost out on the range, couldn't find his buckboard. And while wandering out in the Texas desert heat, his eyes got so swollen he got disabled. And too embarrassed to get on the government dole, he decided he'd be a politician. Wanted to help with the lawyering. And it turns out that Philip Drew, his big dream is to be an administrator. He wants to go into social work to help poor people. Philip Drew ends up being not the president of the U.S., the administrator of the U.S. And as administrator, he establishes policies. Policies such as poor people should never ever have to be poor as long as the government's around. If a husband dies, the government has to take care of the wife and the children. If somebody dies, the government pays for their funeral. If there's no father in the house, the government pays for the education. In fact, Philip Drew establishes Women's Lib before Women's Lib was established. Central bank. Everything in Philip Drew's imagination, this socialist, this administrator, this self-anointed individual, every single aspect of his government is actually in place today in our laws and government. How do you like that? Everything. Every one of his ideals was put in place. Can anybody guess what Woodrow Wilson's favorite book was? Philip Drew, Administrator. Historians write about Woodrow Wilson always consulting with this book. It's a book. It's a political tract, man. It was a book. It was make-believe. Y'all know who FDR was, don't you? Teddy Roosevelt. Y'all hear about all these presidents, all these great guys. Start reading about all the great things they did. You have any idea whose agenda they actually were establishing during their presidency? When all of a sudden you got FDR making speeches saying, "I'm going to make you free from fear. Every American has the right to be free from fear." They got it all out of Philip Drew, from Colonel House. Colonel House was helping run the campaign for Woodrow Wilson, who was actually a puppet for these financiers. Now somebody might say, what the heck does that have to do with the book of Revelation? The Bible has everything to do with it. There's always a voice behind the ruler. Now, a lot of people talk about these presidents as if they established their own legacy or their own history, and yet they never were in control of their own destiny. This is why in the book of Revelation it says it was given to these rulers, it was given to these kings to hate the great harlot. Do you think the families of these presidents like the fact that now, looking back in retrospect, everybody can say that these doctrines that these presidents laid out weren't even theirs? Huh? These great speeches of the four freedoms? Do you really think that the families of these presidents appreciate the fact that after they've built their presidential libraries, do you think they appreciate the fact that somebody can point at their presidency and say nothing they did was of their own accord, nothing they did was of their own ideas, these guys were merely puppets? Huh? Every time you look at, the presidents of the U.S., could you imagine how it feels to look at these guys and realize that the agendas they set, that the laws that went into effect, that even their election or their choosing of Supreme Court justices was not by their own decision, wasn't their own mind? You think their families like this idea? Talking about Colonel House, he was strictly a behind-the-scenes wire puller and is regarded by many historians the real president of the U.S. during the Wilson years. Now, PBS ran a really good special on Woodrow Wilson, and I want you to notice in Woodrow, in that videotape, there's another fellow with a top hat that's always Woodrow Wilson. That's Colonel House. Many people regard him as the real president. House authored a book called Philip Drew Administrator, in which he wrote of establishing socialism as dreamed by Karl Marx. Steps toward his goal, House, both in his book and in real life, called for passage of a graduated income tax. Do we have that? Huh? Did we pass a graduate income tax, federal income tax on people? A central bank, did that happen? Yep. Flexible, inflatable paper currency, that happened too? Isn't that something? This guy writes a novel, and he gets a president to enact every single piece of legislation that he wanted. And what was the goal? Now listen, I'm telling you, Philip Drew Administrator, I'm going to bring copies of that. Philip Drew Administrator, this guy literally dreamed of a world perfecting what Karl Marx couldn't perfect in Russia. Everybody know who Karl Marx was? Son of a rabbi, co-authored supposedly the Communist Manifesto. Now, how many of you were taught in school the Communist Manifesto is evil? Huh? Dirty commies, those Reds, bastards. Huh? Isn't that how we were taught? Communists. A lot of people don't tell you that Engels was an Englishman. Don't tell you that Marx was son of a rabbi. And that literally that manifesto was commissioned from the West. It wasn't Russian-born. It was commissioned in the West. So when we talk about communism, Russia, this great evil empire that Ronald Reagan called it, who made it? It's created in the West. So here you got Woodrow Wilson, a puppet for these bankers, agent for these financiers, who writes a book called Philip Drew Administrator, whose end result is to establish among the people a graduated income tax, to establish a central bank, to establish inflatable paper currency with no gold standard behind it, and every bit of it happens. How'd you like to run into one of Woodrow Wilson's relatives and tell him, you're full of crap? Huh? Somebody says, you insulting a former president? No. But we know who really called the shots. Huh? The graduated income tax and the central bank are two of the 10 planks of the Communist Manifesto. Now, how many of you knew that? That the Communist Manifesto laid down 10 ideals or 10 criteria to totally possess and create a socialist or communist nation. Y'all knew that, right? That's what the Communist Manifesto is. And the graduated income tax and the central bank are two of the 10. So where are we headed? Communism? No. Socialism? Yes. You walk up to the normal person and say, hey, are we going to become communists? Everybody will say what? No. But if you ask them, we going to become socialists? Yeah. In fact, we already are. That's why everybody says, oh, we all deserve health care. Even those of us that don't have jobs. It's not my fault I'm a wino in the street. I need medical attention, and y'all should pay for it. Girl says, oh, it's not my fault I got pregnant. Y'all should pay for the baby and daycare and education and food stamps and cheese and boxes of Kicks. In his intimate papers of Colonel House, Professor Charles Seymour referred to the Colonel as the unseen guardian angel of the Federal Reserve Act. Now again, the Federal Reserve Act was signed into power by guess which president? Woodrow Wilson. Isn't that something? Couldn't pass it with the Republicans, so they bring in a Democrat, and he signs it into power. So next time you're talking to some of them Democrats, tell them how they screwed the nation. All right? You know, it's against the Constitution to let somebody privately mint and coin American money. And yet with the passing of the Federal Reserve Act, our government, or the people, literally turned over that whole power to private banking firms run from England. In his intimate papers of the Colonel House, Professor Charles Seymour refers to the Colonel as the unseen guardian angel of the Federal Reserve Act. Seymour's work contains numerous documents and records showing constant contact between House and Paul Warburg while the Federal Reserve Act was being prepared and steered through Congress. Biographer George Viereck assures us that the Schiffs and the Warburgs and the Kahns and the Rockefellers and the Morgans had put their faith in House. Their faith was amply rewarded. Could you imagine not trusting Woodrow Wilson to the extent that you got to have Colonel House at his side all the time? Now you think Woodrow Wilson's family appreciates this? In order to support the fiction that the Federal Reserve Act was a people's bill, the insiders, financiers put up a smokescreen of opposition to it. It was strictly a case of Briar Rabbit begging not to be thrown into the briar bush. Both Aldrich and Vanderlip denounced what was actually their own bill. 25 years later, Frank Vanderlip admitted, now although the Aldrich Federal Reserve Plan was defeated when it bore the name Aldrich, nevertheless its essential points were all contained in the plan that was adopted. Taking advantage of Congress's desire to adjourn for Christmas, the Federal Reserve Act was passed on December 22, 1913 by a vote of 298 to 60 in the House, and in the Senate a majority of 43 to 25. Wilson had fulfilled to the insiders the pledge he had made in order to become president. Now, doesn't that sound... Now, how many of you learned that in school? Huh? They didn't tell you that? Warburg told House, well, it hasn't quite got everything we want, but the lack of it can be adjusted later by the administrative process. You know what that means? You pass the bill and then you adjust it later when nobody's looking. And it did, by the way. There was genuine opposition to the act, but it had no power, no match to the power of the bill's advocates. Conservative Henry Cabot Lodge Sr. proclaimed with great foresight, the bill as it stands seems to me to open the way to vast inflation of currency. I do not like to think that any law can be passed which will make it possible to submerge the gold standard in a flood of irredeemable paper currency. After the vote, Congressman Charles Lindbergh Sr., father of the famous aviator, told Congress, this act establishes the most gigantic trust on earth. When the president signs the act, the invisible government by the money power proven to exist, by the money trust investigation, will be legalized. This is the Aldrich bill in disguise. The new law will create inflation whenever the trust wants inflation. So it becomes obvious that this money trust, in fact, runs the whole U.S. government. The Federal Reserve Act was and still is hailed as a victory of democracy over the money trust. Nothing could be further from the truth. The whole central bank concept was engineered by the very group it's supposed to strip of its power. The myth that the money trust had been defrocked should have been exploded when Paul Warburg was appointed to the first Federal Reserve Board, a board which was handpicked by Colonel House. Now, part of the Federal Reserve Board, or part of the Federal Reserve Board membership, the criteria was that they should be picked by the president. But the choices made were not actually made by President Wilson, but they were made by Colonel House's suggestion to President Wilson. Now remember who Paul Warburg is. Paul Warburg is a German. So who's the first president of the Federal Reserve Bank in the United States? A German. Isn't that something? How many like the idea? Huh? Got a German guy out there. Not that there's, again, nothing against Germans, but you think if somebody's going to be in charge of the U.S.'s money, don't you want it to be an American? Huh? Specifically, this is 1913. What happened shortly after the Federal Reserve Law passed? Huh? What happened in Europe? Now, let me put it this way. What did Germany do? Remember World War I? How powerful is our central bank? The Federal Reserve controls our money supply and interest rates, and thereby manipulates the entire economy, creating inflation or deflation, recession or boom, setting the stock market up and down at a whim. The Federal Reserve is so powerful that Congressman Wright Patman, chairman of the House Banking Committee, maintains in the United States today, we have in effect two governments. We have a duly constituted government, then we have an independent, uncontrolled, and uncoordinated government in the Federal Reserve System, operating the money powers which are reserved to Congress by the Constitution. So, what do we have here? We have literally a beast with two heads. We're going to stop there. Let's go back to Eustace Mullins. Pretty close to running out of time. Back to page 5. You there in 5? The main problem was Paul Warburg. The main problem, as Paul Warburg informed his colleagues, was to avoid the name central bank. For that reason, he had decided upon the designation of Federal Reserve System. Isn't that deceptive? To know you can't call it a central bank because everybody will know whose money it is? So they decided to call it the Federal Reserve System. Isn't that amazing how easy it is to trick people? Huh? Simply by using the language. And this is one of the reasons why when we speak, you'll always hear me talking about language. There is a power in language that most people don't understand if they don't control the English language. There was a reason why Bill Clinton could sit on television and answer his interrogators with stupid or seemingly stupid to us questions like, it depends on what is. Didn't you get a kick out of that? But did he have to answer anything? Did he say anything? Why? Because he understands and can control his language. The fact that you can control language, which even in our biblical studies shows that the Hebrew language, being a picturesque language, paints a picture for us. The Greek language, being precise, guides us toward the right vision of what is being said. The English language is scattered, but proper manipulation and control of it does something different. If you say central bank, everybody says, no. But if you say Federal Reserve Bank, everybody says, sure. Now, how many of you like the fact that you can be manipulated simply by a word? Huh? Right? Just by changing one word, you can make things happen. This is why, I think I was talking to Eddie Olivas about this last Tuesday. They got that new Bible that's coming out. The one that's getting rid of God as a man. Huh? They want to get rid of God being a man. They want to make him a woman. And all the women like it. Huh? You change a couple words and things change. He's no longer God the Father. Huh? He's no longer the Lord God He. They want to free it up. They say that if they free it up from gender, now it can be applicable to everybody. And you all laugh, but there's a lot of people who like the idea. There's a lot of Christians who like the idea. Some of those dykes on bikes for Jesus. They like that. They like that stuff. Gender free. All right. Rule by secrecy tells us a little bit about this Federal Reserve stuff. Let's see. The birth of the Fed. Vanderlip was referring to a secretive trip on the night of November 22nd, 1910 by 7 men representing perhaps as much as 1/4 of the wealth in the world to Jekyll Island, J.P. Morgan's island retreat off the coast of Georgia. The mission was so secret that only first names were used and the regular servants on the island had been relieved by new employees who didn't know any of the participants. The group secluded themselves for 1 week on Jekyll Island and prepared plans for banking reform, which the government deemed necessary due to a series of financial panics, which again, we read here that Gary Allen says they're manufactured or they were artificially created. Today, many researchers believe these panics were artificially created with a view toward forcing public acceptance of these very reforms. Under pressure from constituents, Congress passed the Aldrich-Vreeland Act of 1908, which authorized national banks to issue emergency currency called script, and created the National Monetary Commission, chaired by Senator Aldrich, who recommended ways of stabilizing the U.S. monetary system. The Commission's final report was prepared by 7 prominent men who secretly journeyed to Morgan's Jekyll Island Hunt Club, ostensibly to hunt duck. The men concluded not to have one central bank in the United States, but several, and they agreed that no one was to utter the word central or bank. More important, they decided that this creation would be made to look like an official agency of the U.S. government. Now look, we always talk about this. We've been saying this since the beginning, and this is why we had to go through that big, 1-hour discourse on what conspiracies are and why people are going to look at you like a nut. But when 7 bankers get together on an island that belongs to J.P. Morgan, and you got Senator Aldrich, who's toured Europe, spending $300,000 of taxpayers' money to come up with an alternative solution to take the ability from bankers to create bank runs that hurt American people, and when he comes back with no report, only to join these men on Jekyll Island to come up with a report, isn't that a conspiracy? Huh? Isn't that a plan? No one was to utter the word central or bank. More importantly, they decided that this creation would be made to look like an official agency of the U.S. government. Speaking before an appreciative audience of the American Bankers Association, Aldrich stated, "The organization proposed is not a bank, but a cooperative union of all the banks of the country for definite purposes. Warburg had conceived of the idea of constructing this cooperative union in a manner palatable by both bankers and the public. Any restrictions on the bankers could be and were removed later. This proposal, which came to be known as the Aldrich Plan after its Senate sponsor, was ill-fated from the start. Too many people saw it was a transparent attempt to create a system of bankers by bankers for bankers. The Aldrich Plan is the Wall Street Plan," warned Congressman Charles Lindbergh, father of the famed aviator. When Aldrich proposed his plans as a bill, it never got out of committee. A new tactic was needed, and it came from the House of Banking and Currency Committee Chairman Congressman Carter Glass of Virginia, who attacked the Aldrich Plan openly, ultimately attacking it for it lacked government control and created a banking monopoly. Glass drafted an alternative called the Federal Reserve Act and expressed anti-Wall Street sentiment. Jekyll Island planners Vanderlip and Aldrich spoke out venomously against Glass's bill, even though the entire sections of it were identical to Aldrich's plan. How many like politics already? This guy comes up with a plan, hates the other guy's plan, talks about it vehemently, and has most of it word for word in his plan. These efforts were underscored by a banking reform organization called the National Citizens League, entirely financed and controlled by the banks. Isn't that something? The function of the organization was to disseminate hundreds of thousands of educational pamphlets. Now, whenever you hear the term educational from the government, you got to watch out. When the government is educating you, now y'all remember the killing fields of Cambodia, right? And when the Khmer Rouge came in, and they went and grabbed everybody with glasses, because everybody with glasses they knew could read. They took them out into the villages, and what did they do to them? Re-educated them, right? You got to forget all the old ways. See, this is why the country for the longest time is always training young people not to listen to older people. Because older people know. Younger people know nothing. Older people know. They just don't get listened to anymore by youngsters. Whenever the government comes up with a system and calls it education, you're getting screwed. You're getting brainwashed. Let me ask you a question. I get a kick out of this. I don't like smoking, but I got mad when the government said we're going to tax everybody who smokes an extra quarter per pack in the tobacco industry. Do you notice that they did holler and scream a little bit? Oh, this is insane. This is crazy. Oh, you know. People still smoke. You ever see those stupid commercials that lie to you on television? About 400,000 people a year died from smoking and smoking-related deaths. I mean, they were all over the Super Bowl. You know how those get paid for? Tobacco money. That's from that 25-cent tax. Did anybody quit? Huh? Probably a few. Could you imagine the tobacco industry pays a quarter to have commercials talking about how many people smoking kills, and yet the more you tell people don't smoke, the more people still smoke? That doesn't drive you crazy? What does the Bible say in Romans? When Paul says, is the law evil? He says, God forbid. The law is good. It's holy, just, and good. What's the problem with the law? He says, I was alive without the law, but when the law came, it killed me. What's he saying? That when God said, thou shalt not, it awoke in you the sin to do it. It's like when you tell your kid, don't get in the cookie jar before dinner. He wasn't even thinking about it, but now he wants to. The minute you lay down the law and say don't do it, it awakens something in our human nature that says do it. So the more you tell people don't smoke, what's going to happen? Man, that's the best thing you could. I mean, could you imagine a quarter tax on every pack of cigarettes to tell people don't do it, that's going to awaken something in them that's going to tell them to do it? Huh? I don't think they could have got any more bang for their advertising buck. The function of the organization was to disseminate hundreds of thousands of educational pamphlets, to organize letter writing campaigns to congressmen, to supply quotable material to the news media, and in other ways to create the illusion of a grassroots support for the Jekyll Island plan. Heading the league was economics professor J. Lawrence Laughlin of the University of Chicago. Now, we haven't gotten there yet, but the University of Chicago is actually sponsored, for much of its grant money comes from the foundations that Rockefeller and these guys established. While popular support for the new banking system was garnered, another often used tactic was played out in the political arena. President William Howard Taft was already on record pledging to veto any legislation creating a central bank. That's why he had to go. A more compliant leader was needed to the bankers. This leader was Woodrow Wilson, the academic who had been retained as the president of Princeton University by his former classmates Cleveland Dodge, Cyrus McCormick, for both directors of Rockefeller's National City Bank of New York. For 20 years before his nomination, Woodrow Wilson had moved in the shadow of Wall Street, wrote Ferdinand Lundberg. Wilson's nomination was secured by the man who would from that point on be his constant companion and advisor, Colonel Edward Mandell House, close associate of Warburg and Morgan. We'll stop there.